Welcome to the Window and Door Manufacturers Association presentation on building code requirements for windows, doors, and skylights. My name is Craig Drumheller. I'm the Vice President of Technical Activities for WDMA, and this course intends to provide a practical understanding of how building codes apply to fenestration products. The Window and Door Manufacturers Association is an American Institute of Architects approved provider that offers educational content, webinars, and webcasts with the option to earn AIA Continuing Education Services Learning Units by completing this course. This slide contains the required AIA CES provider information. Feel free to pause the presentation to read the statement in its entirety. Full participation is required to receive continuing education credits, which includes the follow-up quiz after the presentation. This course is educational in nature and does not constitute an endorsement of any specific product or method. This course will examine primary requirements for windows, doors, and skylights contained in the International Residential Code and the International Energy Conservation Code. We will briefly cover the code development process and code adoption, and this course will focus on the key provisions of the IECC and the IRC, leaving participants with a practical understanding of fenestration requirements for residential applications. We will not cover wind-borne debris and wildland interface region requirements. If you are interested in those topics, please check back later at the WDMA website in 2026. At the conclusion of this course, participants should understand how residential codes are developed and adopted, identify applicable energy requirements, apply life safety provisions such as egress and fall protection, and recognize safety glazing and structural requirements, as well as verify testing, labeling, and installation compliance. Now, the IRC covers 1 and 2 family dwellings. It primarily safety, structural, and egress requirements, but it also has a Chapter 11, which is essentially the 1 and 2 family dwelling version of the IECC. However, the IECC is a comprehensive document that covers both the residential and commercial portions of the built environment. But typically, when a state or jurisdiction adopts an energy code on the residential side, they will strip out Chapter 11 of the IRC and insert the requirements from the IECC. They are virtually identical, but just enough different that they will create it as a separate requirement. The International Code Council develops and publishes full suites of building codes on a 3-year cycle. They have a total of 13 documents, 12 of which are developed using their governmental consensus process, which ultimately the content is decided completely by governmental members, which primarily consist of code officials. Now, the IECC, which is now going through its second iteration of the committee process, is developed with a committee that consists of code officials and professionals in the industry. Codes are adopted throughout the United States, and primarily the building codes consist of the I codes, the ICC developed building codes. Most states update their codes every 3 to 6 years, and each state adopts building codes independently with its own process. Some are purely legislative, some are regulatory, some are a combination of regulatory getting finalized through a legislative process, but each state has its own code adoption process. Adoption processes typically take from 2 to 5 years from publication, and as you can see with the 2 figures on the left, the upper one being the IECC and the lower one being the adoption of the IRC. The darker colors show the more recently adopted codes, and the lighter colors are codes that are either the 2009 or the 2012 versions. And the grayed out states are states that do not use the I codes, at least for those particular versions. The topics that we're going to cover today in the building code is energy, egress, emergency escape and rescue openings, fall protection, and safety glazing. I wanted to start out with the word fenestration. A lot of people they hear that they're not clear exactly what it is, or where it came from. So just a quick FYI overview. But it comes from the Latin word fenestra, meaning window. It has evolved simply to mean an opening in the wall. Most European language use a derivation of the Latin word today. The Italian word is fenestra, French is fenetra, and German is fenster. Um, in the building code and in architecture, fenestration typically refers to windows and doors, and often in skylights. And in today's context, it will include skylights as fenestration. So the energy codes. So there's the IECC, which we're going to be talking about today, the commercial code, which consists of commercial buildings and residential buildings 4 stories and above. The residential code, single family and townhomes, as well as low-rise multifamily residential. So when we're talking about the residential IECC, single family, townhomes, and low-rise residential, meaning 3 stories or less. In the IRC, Chapter 11, it refers to 1 and 2 family homes, and a townhome is actually a single family home. Even though they're all in the same structure, each unit is considered a single family home. Now, there's also ASHRAE 90.1, which has the same scoping as the IECC, but it is an independently developed standard. And both the IECC residential and ASHRAE 90.1 are referred to in EPCA. This is a federal statute using them as the benchmarks for state adoption. Now, the first thing that people should understand with the energy code is that it's very climate dependent, and just wanted to kind of put a calibration together for people to understand what climate zones mean what. So here we have the lighter pink in the south, the Miami area, and if you can see in the Brownsville, Texas, just the very southern tip of Texas, and Florida and Hawaii. All 3 of those are the only places where climate zone 1 exists in the United States. And as you work your way north, the swath through around the Gulf of Mexico is climate zone 2. The orange is climate zone 3. Through the central United States is in yellow is 4, 5 from Pennsylvania, Iowa, Nebraska, and 6 up in the dark blue. 7 you see in the upper north of Maine, Minnesota, and North Dakota, as well as the southern part of Alaska. And the very coldest climate zone is climate zone 8, which includes Fairbanks and points north where not a lot of people live. So generally, southern climate zones are lower than the northern climate zones. So the compliance pass, there's a couple different ways, 3 different ways that you can meet the requirements of the IECC. One is referred to as the prescriptive requirements, which you are very well defined with a little bit of flexibility, but not much to meet the prescriptive requirements. The performance requirements need a computer simulation against a prescriptive home with the same geometry. So it will do the calculations. It compares the prescriptive requirements that are in the code with the actual specs of the house being built. And as long as it uses the same or less energy, it would be compliant. And then there's also an energy rating index. Many people might know this as the HERS index, or from ResNet, the Residential Energy Services Network, which compares back to a 2006 home that has a reference score of 100. So a building code might have a requirement of a score of 56 or 52. And so essentially you're using half, a little more than half of the energy that a 2006 home might have used. So it's strictly a score of overall performance. So the IECC, the prescriptive path, and this is not the comprehensive look at all the prescriptive requirements. We're really just going to focus on the fenestration. And this shows all the climate zones 0, which does not exist in the United States. That is really more of the arid desert of Northern Africa and the Middle East. So it doesn't exist here in the United States, but climate zones 1 through 8 do. And it shows that the requirements, as you can see, the vertical fenestration U factor. And here's where we distinguish between vertical fenestration, meaning in a wall, or skylights, which would be most likely in a roof or in a in a slanted type installation. So as we go from the lower climate zones up to the more northern climate zones, you can see that the U factors actually go down, meaning that they perform better. So U factor is a measure of conductance. So the lower it is, uh, the more resistant it is to the movement of heat, unlike an R value where the higher the value, the more resistant the R value is to the movement of heat. So here we're going to be talking in R values, and then there's also the solar heat gain coefficient, which you can see is lower in the south than it is as you move north to climate zone 4. And then as you get up to climate zones 5 and above, there is no requirement because you really don't want to limit the amount of sunlight coming into the house. As I say, the sun is your friend. So there are no requirements as you go farther north for either fenestration or for um, skylights. Now, this is the only math that we're going to have for today, but in addition to those requirements, you can have specific. So if you have a U factor of 0.25, and you have some windows that are higher than that, which wouldn't comply on their own, but you can use what they call an area weighted averaging. As long as you have enough offsetting it that are higher performing than the lower performing one, as long as that weighted average is at or below the prescriptive requirement, you can still comply using the prescriptive approach. And this is just a simple math saying, here's double hung windows, 120 square feet at a U factor of 0.3 gives you an area U factor of 36. And the same with the casement window of 40 with a U factor of 40 square feet, U factor of 0.28, a U area of 11.2, and the glazed doors, U area of 12.8. That sums up to 60 over 200 square feet. And if you look over here, you have the 200 square feet. Now you have an effective U factor of 0.3. So if your target was 0.3 in your prescriptive requirements, this particular set of windows and glazing would meet that requirement. And the same is true with the solar heat gain coefficient. The only note there is that doors that are more than 50% glazed, meaning they get closer to opaque, meaning with no glazing in it, those would not go into the solar heat gain coefficient calculation. Now, there are also, the IECC has set up some hard limits for fenestration, meaning that you can't go above the values that are set here. Meaning you can't have, if you're in climate zone 0 through 3, you can't have a solar heat gain coefficient that's above 0.4, or in climate zones 4 and 5, you can't have a U factor that's above 0.48, or in climate zones 6 through 8, or 0.40. And these are weighted averages, and it applies to the performance path as well as the prescriptive path, and does not comply to to the, the ResNet path. the, 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 Now in Windows, you'll typically see this label here that's called the NFRC label, and it shows the performance of the energy performance of the window. In this particular case, this is just a generic NFRC label with a U factor of 0.35 and a solar heat gain factor or coefficient of 0.32, as well as some other specifications, visible transmittance of 0.51, a condensation resistance on a scale of 1 to 100, and an air leakage rate. It's not a specific value, but it shows that it is less than or equal to 0.3. Now, if you do not have this label, and this is written into the code, if you do not have this label, then you must use what they call default values. And these default values are not very generous. So you would have extreme difficulty passing code with windows that are not labeled with the NFRC label. Here you can see that the U factor of a metal window, single pane is a 1.2, or even a double pane is a 0.8. So at a 0.8, you are more than double, almost triple the conductance that you're permitted in most places in the United States. So to comply, you're much better off with windows being labeled with the NFRC label. So the IECC has installation and air sealing requirements. This is part of a much larger table, but I just wanted to extract the portion that applied to windows, doors, and skylights. And it essentially says use the manufacturer's installation instructions. And this is true of creating the air barrier while you're doing the installation, as well as insulating around the window and the window gaps. So in building codes, typically the manufacturer's instructions would override any of the requirements that are in the code, or where the code is silent. Now, air leakage. The fenestration air leakage for windows and skylights is limited to a cap of 0.3 CFM per square foot, which is actually the number that's showing on the NFRC label. So there you can show compliance, and it shows that it is less than or equal to 0.3. So it just meets the requirement. It may perform much better, but frequently that is what you will see on these labels. Now, if you have a swinging door, it's a slightly higher requirement at 0.5 CFM per square foot, and that should also show up on the NFRC label for a window or for a door. Now, the IECC has some exceptions and other requirements that I thought would be worthwhile to mention, that the prescriptive requirements apply to replacement windows and doors. So if you are getting replacement windows, you're essentially going to be stuck either averaging the windows using a weighted average to get compliance, or every window must comply with the prescriptive requirement for your climate zone. There are exemptions for historic buildings. You'd have to check with your local code department on how they interpret that. Some are national and state historically recognized buildings. Some are others that might be older, where they might provide an exemption for that. But before you purchase any windows, I would strongly suggest contacting your local building department. In the prescriptive path, they do have an exemption for 15 square feet of glazing, and where there isn't a U factor or solar heat gain requirement. And this is probably for decorative glass or some specialty window that you may want to install. And the same is true of a door in the prescriptive method. I believe it's 28 feet square foot of door area is permitted to be exempt from the requirements. This could be a home, a custom-made door that hasn't gone through some of the testing that the NFRC testing or some other testing that other products might be required to do. Heated sunrooms also have separate requirements that we won't get into. But if it's an unheated sunroom, there are no requirements. It's only if it's a conditioned space would there be any thermal requirements on the sunroom. So just kind of looking forward, um, where the energy code is going, there's a new category of energy credits that started in the with the 2021 code. It got a little bit more formalized in the 2024 code. And now I'm a member of the IECC residential committee, and we're taking it a little bit further in what's going to be published as the 2027 code that's going to come out later this year and have a little bit higher level of requirements. It basically says you have to pass all of the prescriptive requirements and then do a little bit more on the order of 10% on these extra credit points that will allow for compliance in the prescriptive path. There are points available for higher performing fenestration, so something to keep in mind if you're doing new construction. And also there's a stronger effort to get a net zero energy rating, and it's in Appendix RC. It's not only less prescriptive, it's not prescriptive, and there's a lot of variances in design where people take a different approach. So, you know, when the point 0.3 window was always very popular, now when you're getting to net zero, somebody might want to do it a lot with windows. Some might say, you know what, I'm going to use some other effort. So there's going to be more variances in design going forward as people begin to figure out how they're going to get these higher and higher performing homes. Now on to the IRC. So there's a lot of requirements for a lot of different products in Chapter 3, which is referred to as building planning. But a number of items that impact fenestration are all also contained within Chapter 3. And we're going to cover a little bit more detail on means of egress, EERO, which is emergency escape and rescue openings, as well as window fall protection and safety glazing. So Chapter 3 was reorganized in the publication of the 2024 IRC. So I'm going to show the different numbering for some people that might still be on some of the older codes, and might want to also understand that it also is contained in the newer edition of the codes if and when they move to the 2024 IRC. So we'll start off with means of egress. So each dwelling unit must have one unobstructed path to an egress door that gets you out into a yard or a public way. A door to a garage would not qualify. A door to a deck that doesn't have egress to stairs would not qualify. But again, it's only one door, and it must have a minimum width of 32 inches and a minimum height of 78. 78 inches, a typical height for a door. And it must be openable without keys or special knowledge. That's a phrase that's frequently used when it comes to escape routes, whether it's egress, which is more of a we'll call it a casual exit, as opposed to what we'll move on to now is an emergency escape and rescue opening. And this is more frequently referred to when you're talking about windows. And it shall be provided, meaning if you have a basement must have an EERO. It could be a door, but it's got to have some way to get out, and it must meet all the EERO requirements. This is also true of a habitable attic, and every sleeping room must also have an EERO, must have this emergency escape and rescue opening. And to be able to get through this opening, you must have, they must open from the inside, again, without the use of keys, tools, or special knowledge. It must have an opening control device or fall protection. We'll talk about that, and must meet minimum dimensions. So the window opening control device, or a WOCD, must be compliant with ASTM F2090, and this will be labeled on any window that is compliant as an EERO with a WOCD. And the definition used to be contained, or it still is contained within F 2090, but in the 2027 IRC, it will also have this definition directly in the code that shows really the three primary uses of a or functions required of an EERO or WOCD. Opening that stops at less than 4 inches, meaning it will not allow a 4-inch diameter sphere to work its way through. This is a typical size that's used in a number of areas in the building code, including like stair rail balusters to make sure that you don't have larger spacing so small children can't get through those spaces. It must be releasable to fully open without tools, meaning it goes from that 4-inch opening up to a full opening to the required dimensions. And the two figures to the left, the top one shows a horizontal slider where it opens to 4 inches, and then the red, where the red arrow is, or the red block, is where you would have the release that would allow it to fully open. And then on the bottom, you have the double hung or single hung window where you have these releases that you've probably seen before that will allow the window to fully open. And then it must also be able to reset when it's closed. So as you can see with the double hung on the left, you've got that latch that you can push to release, and then you can see when the window would go down past it, it would pop back out into that position, not allowing the window to open up again until it's once again triggered. So the actual dimensions, there are a few different. So the minimum width must be at least 20 inches. The minimum height must be 24 inches. But more importantly, the overall openable area must be 5.7 square feet. So if you have a 20-inch width, you must have a 41-inch height. And if you have a 24-inch height, you must have a minimum 34-inch width to meet that full 5.7 square feet. And it must be no higher, the sill must be no higher than 44 inches in order to permit easy egress through the opening. And just kind of a side note there that if you are on grade, if this window or EERO is on grade, the minimum gets reduced to 5 square feet rather than the 5.7 square feet. If you are below grade, that 44-inch minimum still holds true. The 5.7 square feet still holds true, as well as the 20-inch width and the 24-inch height. But there's also in the well, right? So since you're below grade now, the well must be a minimum of 36 inches by 36 inches. And if you are more than 44 inches below grade, there must be a ladder that allows you to get out. So fall protection. So there's requirements for fall protection if you have a window that is 24 inches or less above the finished floor and it is greater than 72 inches above the outside finished grade. So again, if you're in a garden style apartment or split level house, you might have windows that are less than 6 feet above the outside finished grade. But if it's any more than that, and you have a lower window, then you're going to need to have fall protection. Now, the fall protection can be one of two ways. Either you have the 4-inch stop on the opening, or you have a WOCD, again, this window opening control device, or have other fall protection, meaning guards. Now, if you have a guard, You got to make sure that the window that you're putting this on is not the means of is not an EERO opening, um, because it would probably require special tools to get those guards off. Now, glazing. There's a lot of different applications for glazing and different requirements on hazardous locations. Now, the hazardous locations are defined for each one of if you're in a door, near a door, um, floors, glazing near floors and stairs, glazing in windows, and glazing in bathroom shower areas. And if it's determined that it is a hazardous location, then it must be somehow compliant with ANSI Z97.1 or the Consumer Products Safety Committee's 16 CFR Part 1201. And the typical way that they're compliant with these glazing materials is for hazardous location is a tempered glass, meaning it's been treated, and when it breaks, it doesn't break in shards, it breaks into smaller pieces, so it won't cut like an old glass might. Laminated glass where it's covered in or coated with a layer of usually kind of a plastic that's adhered to it that keeps everything together, or it's a plastic piece and it doesn't shatter like glass does. And in addition to it just being compliant, it must be permanently labeled. And an example here to the right is just a manufacturer where it shows it's 16 CFR 1201 compliant, that it's ANSI Z97.1 compliant to the 2015 version. It's the Safety Glazing Certification Council 5280 and the Canadian General Standards Board 12 standard 12.1 of 2017, and it was manufactured in 2022. So this is information that you can see if you see glazing in any door, you can look at this etching that is probably in one of the corners. So the glazing in or near doors, glazing within doors with areas greater than a 3-inch diameter, so anything essentially larger than a peephole. If it's within 24 inches of a door, so it's not the door itself, but it might be a side light within 24 inches of the door, any part of the glazing. So if any part of the glazing is within 24 inches of the door, that whole piece of glazing must be safety glazing. And any part of the glazing is less than 60 inches from the floor in the plane of the door. And the example of that upper part of the drawing kind of shows that the distance from the door and the height, both on the right and the left, would need to be safety glazed. Now, a little bit more complex is within the 24 inches and out of plane on the hinge side of the door. So it's been determined that the latch side of the door does not need to be required if it's out of plane, but on the hinge side it does. Apparently they've determined that that's the way that there's much more chance of breakage on the hinge side. So there's an exception to that. If there's an intervening wall between the door and the glazing, then it wouldn't apply. But in typical cases, it would apply. Glazing in windows. So all of these must apply for there be a requirement or consideration of a hazardous location. The individual pane is larger than 9 square feet. So not if you'd have a double hung window and the whole window is greater than 9 square feet, but each one of the sashes is not, then it would not apply. But it would if you have an individual pane larger than 9 square feet and the bottom edge of the glazing is less than 18 inches from the floor and the top edge is more than 36 inches from the floor, and there's a walking surface within 36 inches horizontally from the glazing. So meaning if you have a an open foyer on the second floor and a big picture window, that would not need to be safety glazing, even if it met the other requirements, because there would more than likely not be a walking surface within 36 inches horizontally from the glazing. So glazing and wet surfaces. So we're talking about wet areas, hot tubs, whirlpools, bathtubs, showers, swimming pools, etc. Um, any glazing that has a portion less than 60 inches above the standing or walking surface would be a hazardous location, kind of as depicted in the figure here. Um, but it does not apply if you're more than 60 inches horizontally from the edge of the surface. So if, for example, that window would be on the opposite side of the room and more than 5 feet away from that bathtub, then it would not apply. So now with stairs. So if you are adjacent to stairs, and there's glazing. So the hazardous location, if the bottom edge is more than, or I'm sorry, less than 36 inches from the walking surface, then it would be required to be safety glazing. There's an exception to that. So if you have a handrail and you put it on that side and it kind of it blocks the window at that 36-inch level, then you would be fine. And the previous one applied to intermediate landings on a stairway. This here is the glazing at the bottom of the stair landing. So if this is now you're at the floor level as opposed to an intermediate landing. So now if you have glazing less than 36 inches above the landing and essentially within 5 feet of the bottom of the here it says the tread nosing, then that if it's not protected, then it would also need to be safety glazing and it would be classified as a hazardous location. So now the IRC, there's a lot of testing requirements and labeling requirements, and kind of want to run through that real quickly. So exterior windows and sliding doors. So all exterior windows and sliding doors shall be labeled for compliance with AMA, WDMA, CSA 101, IS2, A440, also known as NAFS, or the North American Fenestration Standard. Exterior side hinge doors shall be labeled for compliance with either NAFS or ANSI WMA 100. So they have another method of compliance, so they don't need to be fully compliant with NAFS. Now, fenestration must also be listed and labeled with performance characteristics of ASTM E1886 and ASTM E1996 or AMA 506. Those are for high wind zones, and I indicated that we really aren't going to be covering that today, but did want to mention that that is another label that may be required based on your location. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, with safety glazing, that must be labeled with ANSI Z97.1 or CPSC 16 CFR Part 1201. Skylights and slope glazing um, includes unit skylights, tubular daylighting devices, and glazed materials with a slope of less than 60 degrees from horizontal. So that's the distinction between a skylight and a vertical fenestration is that 60-degree angle. And the glazing materials must be in these skylights, tubular daylights, and any other glazed materials that must be laminated glass, and the thickness of it is dependent on size, fully tempered glass, heat strengthened glass, wired glass, or an approved rigid plastic. And the trick to this is also screens may be required below the skylight in some circumstances, so you might want to check for those. Most skylights today are made of materials in such a way that a screen is not required, but you might want to check just to make sure anytime you're installing a skylight. The unit skylights and a roof require on the outside a 4-inch minimum curb just to prevent water from getting up over top of the skylights. And unit skylights must comply with NAFs and be labeled with NAFs, just as the windows and sliding glass doors are. So in summary, I'd say codes evolve. You need to stay up to date. If you're using building codes, if you're out there in the field or you're specing products. Adoption and amendments vary by state and even jurisdiction. Um, you need to check with the local code official if you've got any real questions on what might be required in that particular area. Fenestration must meet energy, safety, and structural requirements. Uh, they're very complicated devices. You know, some of the windows and doors, and they've got a lot of requirements to make sure that the people that are using them stay safe. The geographic location matters, whether you're in Key West, Florida, or if you're in a high wind zone and we'll say lower heating and cooling requirements, or if you're in Fairbanks, Alaska, or other places. So there's different requirements, and you need to make sure both structurally, energy efficiency requirements, just to make sure that you're purchasing the right product that's going to perform the way that it needs to perform. So WDMA would like to thank you for attending this webinar on residential building code requirements for windows, doors, and skylights. We hope it's been helpful in providing you with understanding residential building code requirements. This concludes the American Institute of Architects continuing education session portion of the course. You will have the opportunity to earn one AIA CES unit from the American Institute of Architects by taking the course quiz. Upon completion and passing the quiz, you will receive a certificate for your records. If you have any questions about this webinar or want to learn more about WDMA, you may contact any of the staff members listed on the screen. Thank you.